and welcome to the channel. When I was young, for the longest time, my parents tried to keep me away from the internet. They always saw the negativity that came from it, and ignored the potential it had. Of course, they couldn't keep it up forever. Eventually, it became more and more accessible, and they finally gave in and we got a family computer. The computer itself was nothing spectacular, but what it contained was truly the new, man-made wonder that grew. Every day, when I got home from school, I would go online and read every article I could find, peeking into people's lives through personally written blogs, and play the assortment of games that people had made. I couldn't explore everything, because my parents had put a filter on the computer. I was young at the time, only 12 years old, but honestly, I had no interest in that kind of stuff. They wanted to protect me from it. A few years later, I started to find interesting stories. I can never tell if they were fiction or not, because they were often never credited to an author. They were also passed around so much that you could never find an original source. This gave these stories more mystery. Many of them were ridiculous, unrealistic murderers and impractical monsters. However, one story caught my attention and stayed with me ever since I read it. It was called the Russian Sleep Experiment. It was about Russian researchers who conducted an experiment on some captured prisoners of war. They falsely promised them their freedom if they sat in a chamber with a gas that would suppress their desire and need for sleep. Eventually, they deteriorated mentally, and the scientists found them as shells of their human selves. They were mutilated. Their guts were hanging out of their bodies, and yet they were still alive. Not only that, but they showed extraordinary strength. They only wanted one thing, to be put back on the gas. It ends with one of the ordered some scientists to put them back into the test chamber, and for the scientists to go in and manually the monstrosities by hand. This triggers a reaction from one of the scientists, who grabs the general's gun, shoots him, and points it at one of the last surviving patients. The creature explains that it is what lies dormant in each of us, a hidden demon that we suppress with our natural need for sleep. That was a condensed version of the story anyway. I highly recommend reading it. When I read this story, I was in shock. Was it real? Who wrote it? Is it possible? These questions and more flooded my mind, and stayed with me for a few years of my life. I've seen a lot of leaked, experimental documents from the 2 world wars. Bats with bombs, dogs with 2 heads. It wasn't the most absurd scientific idea I'd ever seen. From those times, as time went on, things were pushed back, even though my love of psychology and interesting behavioral experiments still held my interest. I focused on the old controversial ones like the Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment, where Zimbardo organized some students to imprison other students and keep them prisoner. Eventually, it led to authoritarian control, and it led to the mock police using actual brutality and psychological torture to maintain control. Another one I just love is the Milgram experiment. Some paid volunteers, labeled as teachers, were given control of an electric shock device. They were asked to ask the student a series of questions, but they were also warned about the learner's difficult state. If wrong, the teacher administered an electric shock and moved on to the next question. Each time the voltage was increased by 15%. After a number of shocks, the learner would eventually feel so much pain that he would start banging on the wall. He would complain about his heart condition, but the scientist would simply the teacher to continue. Finally, after being told they wouldn't be held responsible, the teacher would deliver the fatal blow and go way beyond what the subject could handle. What I love about this is that you think it's the loner being tested, but it's actually an actor. Nobody really died in this experiment. The experiment was set up to test people's obedience, and that test shattered expectations. Most psychologists suggested that most people would stop before reaching the lethal level of 450 volts. 450 volts, but even though they were all showed signs of stress, and even offered to leave the experiment without being paid. 65% of the participants went over the limit. It was an astonishing display of raw human nature, although some controversial parallels have been drawn between the atrocities of the Holocaust and how people fall into the demand of authority. These cases and more revealed and inferred many dark motives behind our polite human exterior. But these cases and more are also the reason why ethical standards in psychology have been established. Today, you can't do anything remotely as intense as the experiments of the good old days. Principles and guidelines are now so restrictive that you can hardly test anything ambitious about the human mind and will, and I hate it. I have submitted my ideas and hypotheses for many tests that, which I felt, could advance our understanding of ourselves at our rawest level, but legalities and ethics were a barrier I couldn't overcome. I wanted to be the one who set up these mazes of will and see if we were capable of functioning as our primitive selves once were. I worked hard for my degree, which I saw as my ticket to that level of power. But all I had in my hand was a glorified piece of paper that made me listen to people's feelings. There was no way I could get funding from any official government body, so I would have to do the next best thing, fund it myself. However, I was sitting on a mountain of student debt. I was that far behind before. It was a good thing. I was qualified to be paid a ridiculous amount of money by listening to people's feelings. It wasn't easy at first, starting out as a junior, then working my way up to a private counselor. But I did it, and now I was making bank with minimal input. After a while, I had saved enough for a good first experiment, something that had influenced me and piqued my curiosity about the world of experiments. The Russian sleep experiment. The idea was to prevent someone from sleeping for a long time. The body has many deterrents to sleep: caffeine, fear, adrenaline, pain. I went to the drawing board and planned a schedule. The next task was the room. Luckily, I lived in a detached house, and the distance between my house and the neighbors was relatively far away. First, I saved it for a basement extension to the house. After that was done, I soundproofed it. The walls were the best insulation I could find. The best thing about doing this now is that I could change the problem the researchers had. In the original experiment, they had to look at the subjects through a small portal window, whereas I could see everything in crisp HD at a relatively low cost. The icing on the cake was the reinforced door to prevent the subject from escaping. Once everything was set up, I needed a test subject. Of course, no one would volunteer, and I couldn't go through any official channels, so I had to improvise. Luckily, at work, I found the perfect person. For a couple of weeks, I had been counseling a guy called Josh Kent. He'd been complaining about voices in his head and strange urges that he was afraid of. Anyway, as far as I could tell, there was never anything wrong with him. He just needed someone to talk to, and having these problems meant he had a reason to see someone. Me, he had recently lost his mother and his wife in the same month, and he had no children or family to talk to. Because of the tragedy, he left his job. So he came to me with various problems that he thought he had, but honestly, it would just turn into idle chatter because in reality, he just wanted someone to talk to. Nice guys are rare. He would pay for it. Expensive chin wag. With the large inheritance he'd received, with no strings attached, he was the perfect person to use. He was disposable to society. So, in a way, I was almost doing the world a favor. I didn't have to wait long before he made another appointment, no doubt to talk about how lonely he had been and how life had changed for him. We engaged in our usual way, and while he relaxed, I slipped behind him and squeezed the contents of a syringe I had hidden behind my wrist into his neck. He dropped like a sack of potatoes, and I easily managed to sneak him into my house unnoticed. He was peaceful as I dressed him in the clean, white clothes. This was probably the last sleep he would ever have. I thought to myself. I changed his arms and legs to prevent him from escaping. Since the gas used in the original experiment had never been, I had to use what I knew would work. The syringes, an occasional dose of adrenaline, and a constant supply of caffeine in his water. And food supply. I could do a good job of keeping him awake. And for the times when he would really force himself to sleep, his restraints were wired to shock him with a strong jolt by remote control. After setting up, I waited for him to wake up. Finally, he came to, and I pressed the button linked to the intercom. "Welcome, Josh. I'm sure you're confused, but don't worry. You're here for a reason. You have always spoken of these voices and that you were afraid of. Well, I'm about to do a great experiment to resolve these issues. Don't be frightened. Everything happens for a reason. Trust me." As I said this, I saw his face contort into that of fear, then regret. A million thoughts must have gone through his mind, thoughts that I will never know. After he had calmed down a little, I explained what would happen. I talked about how I was going to treat his condition by a new experiment by resetting the brain. I told him that in order to achieve this, I had to stop him sleeping for 30 days. Reaching the 30th day was never my main goal. My first goal was to beat the days of the original experiment. Experiment 12 days. I also never told him my real intention. That would have been stupid. It would only have caused panic. That way he would be more cooperative. A day passed while I watched him on the monitors, and he was a little tired. However, he was stable and alert due to the small and regular doses of caffeine. Occasionally, I would see him trying to sleep, but unable to do so. The times when he was almost able, I would use the intercom to remind him to stay awake. And when he was less cooperative, I would give him a small, harmless jolt through the restraints. He would shout obscenities at me afterwards, but I would remind him that it was for his own good, and he'd be less hysterical. I was not. I felt the effects badly. Something so simple, so flawed in the experiment. I had to monitor him constantly, but I also had to sleep. Halfway through that second day, I risked it. I laid my head on my desk and set an alarm for 6 hours. That would be plenty of sleep. When I awoke, my eyes were still heavy, but I was rested enough for another shift of watching Josh. However, when I looked at the screen, I saw that he was motionless. My eyes widened as I realized why. He was asleep. I ran into the room and shocked him violently. I let out my frustration at both Josh and myself. "Come on, Josh. You have to stay awake for this to work," I yelled. "It's too hard. Can't we try something else?" Josh replied wearily. I jabbed his arm as he said this with a small shot of adrenaline. Then he made a speech about how this was for the best, and how it would help him for the rest of his life. He took what I said in his stride, but I could see that he was losing faith. I wasn't going to let his lack of willpower affect the magnitude of what I wanted to achieve. To explore what lies deep within our subconscious minds is something too precious to be wasted because of unwillingness to cooperate. As I walked away, I thought about how this experiment might fail because of the simple flaw in the plan, that I had to be awake to monitor it. I cursed myself as I sat down and complained about the lack of professionalism that, with this kind of underground research, I had no extra staff, no special monitoring equipment, no scientists to help with the chemicals. But I was determined to do it. Besides, I was too far in. There was no way I could go back now, and it would be a monumental task to rebuild it. It had to be now. My new goal was simply to Josh for as long as possible. I could see signs that would prove my hypothesis. I sat down at the computer screen, reset the clock, and watched Josh for the rest of the day. 24 hours later, and my eyes were heavy. I stared at the glowing image of Josh. He probably felt the same way. I saw him start to nod, so I sipped some caffeine and told him to stay awake. over the intercom. Minutes passed, and I knew he was beginning to ignore me in favor of his desire to sleep. I got up and slowly made my way to the cell, to tilt his head into a comfortable position. I raised my arm and the needle straight into his neck, forcing the adrenaline into his body. His eyes fluttered open from the shock, and soon he was shaking from the reaction to the chemical. I exhaled in agreement and slowly made my way back to my seat. However, I wasn't doing so well myself. I looked down at my supply of adrenaline and wondered, how long would it be before I had to use it on myself? I poured myself some coffee and continued to watch. 46 hours had passed. I leaned back in my chair and took in the fact that we were almost there. Mark, something that probably done by many students trying to crack their finals or workers trying to meet deadlines. However, I felt we were getting closer to the end, 57 hours in, and it felt like I was being dragged into the depths of the land of Ned. Josh, obviously much less motivated to stay awake than I was worse off. Since the 2-day mark, I had already given him 2 half doses of adrenaline, and even had to use one myself. The caffeine was starting to become almost ineffective, with how deprived of sleep we both were. I was also starting to hallucinate. Small things at first, small shapes moving off to the side of my vision, sounds that shouldn't have been there. My head would drop to the weight. I felt in my head before I was jolted awake, fighting the urge to sleep. My ears rang with a searing screech coming from the cell. I looked up at the screen to see Josh, screaming his lungs out and tearing at his restraints. "I don't want to be here anymore. Get me out of here," he screamed. His will was hanging by a thread. It wouldn't be long before it would start to turn against my needs, but I couldn't let that happen. There was too much at stake. Many grueling hours later, we were both at a standstill. The timer indicated that 62 hours had passed. The effects of fatigue were eating away at both of us. Joshua, in particular, was losing much of his energy, his constant crying and babbling, interspersed with his pleas to be released. His wrists were raw from the tugging and struggling that came from his protest at being held against his will. My condition wasn't much better. I was incredibly tired, yet one thing kept me going. As I watched Josh, I would occasionally glance over at my copy of the Russian sleep experiment, and the more Josh's mentality deteriorated, the more it began to align with what was documented in front of me. I wondered why it was having an effect on me, but perhaps I had a particularly strong aversion to the effects because I was fully aware of them and had the willpower to muscle through the whole ordeal. So with that in mind, the more extreme things became, the more I realized I had to keep going. Hour 91. Time was moving slowly, and my heart was racing to keep up with keeping Josh awake. I had to start matching adrenaline doses with Josh, which I had to increase the frequency of this mixed with the caffeine pills and other stimulants. My chest felt tight, and my mind was floating on clouds. Fortunately, I had only one focus, and that was keeping Josh awake. Along with so many drugs, I had to use the shock device that was wired to Josh's restraints. I don't know if it was because it was becoming necessary, or because of my ability to into a cell on a regular basis was almost non-existent, but it worked. As for Josh himself, he would dip in and out of erratic behavior, usually when he was either shocked or when I came in with some chemicals. This threw me for a loop as tossing and screaming was very close to what was described in the original experiment, but it was usually stimulated by my presence. The only way to verify this was to carry on, and so I did. The timer ran for 144 hours. I scribbled something haphazardly about how 6 days had passed, but it wasn't very comprehensive. Josh was awake, but in an almost unconscious state. His head was submerged, dribbling out of his mouth. and occasionally babbling nonsense. He was responding to messages, but I couldn't understand any of it. Both our arms and necks have the same, of red dots. I didn't know how fatal the amount of adrenaline we were talking about was, but I was sure the human body could take a lot. I mean, it is naturally present in the body. Josh's head dropped and his eyes closed. I slowly stood up and shuffled over to the remains of the adrenaline supply. The weight of doubt dragged on my heels. More time had passed. I stared at the clock, the seconds rolling over to zeros again. The minutes roll over to more zeros, and the hours show the next benchmark. 192 hours, 8 days. I look over at Josh. His face is dry from the loss of tears and saliva. The fight in his eyes is gone. The only thing that kept me from pronouncing him dead was the small movement from his chest that, almost routinely, his eyes began to close. It was time for another shot. I dragged myself to his form. I dropped to my knees and looked at him. Nothing about him screamed animal. Something had gone wrong. Perhaps it was the chemical they used in the original experiment. Perhaps he slept in his sleep. When I was in a lapse of concentration, doubts about the validity of this story weighed heavily on my mind, but I could neither confirm nor deny it. Still, because of the increasing number of errors in my personal study, I jagged the needle where my arm lands and pushed the fluid into his bloodstream. A few seconds and he reacted. He began to twitch for a few seconds. After that, his head dropped and stopped moving. I looked closely and saw he was losing the small chest movement that indicated breathing. It wasn't hard to figure that out. He was now dead. I had the means to revive him, but I had neither the energy nor the motivation to do so. As I lay down, with the events of the 8 days running through my mind, only one thing was on my mind. As I closed my eyes with a great sense of relief, I really hope I wake up